What if Emu, the true power behind the world government, personally appeared at Marineford? How different would the outcome of the war be with such a significant change? Well, everything stays the same up to the paramount war at Marineford. Ace has been captured and sentenced to execution. Whitebeard has declared war on the Marines, and Luffy, having broken out of Impel Down with a ragtag crew, arrives at Marineford with one goal: save his brother. But in the background, something else is happening. Deep within Mary Joyce, the five elders are delivering a report that even they find difficult to say out loud. Ace, Luffy, and Whitebeard are all converging at the same location at once. Three massive threats in one moment. Emu listens in silence, and then, for the first time in centuries, the ruler of the world makes a decision that sends a chill through even the elders themselves. Emu will go to Marineford personally. This is too important to leave in anyone else's hands. And so, before the war even properly begins, Emu is already there, hidden deep within the forests of Marineford, cloaked behind the five elders who surround them like a wall of iron. Sengoku and the admirals are informed, and to their credit, they keep their composure. But anyone close enough can see that even these giants of the marine world are shaken. The tension radiating from the top brass filters down through the ranks, and Marines who have no idea who Emu even is begin to feel it. The Marines are being disrupted not by the enemy, but by the secret in their own fortress. The war begins in earnest. Whitebeard's fleet clashes with the Marines in what is already being called the greatest battle the world has ever seen. Like a walking fortress, the warlords engage with devastating force. Cannon fire lights up the air like deadly fireworks, and the ground of Marineford shakes from the sheer force of the clashing powers. But amid all of this, Whitebeard pauses. The old emperor has stood against the greatest warriors the world has to offer his entire life, and has never so much as flinched. But what he feels in that moment, emanating from somewhere deep inside Marineford, is something else entirely. It is ancient, suffocating, like the weight of centuries pressing down on the air itself. Whitebeard narrows his eyes and quietly warns his commanders to stay on high alert. Something is wrong, something beyond this war. Meanwhile, Luffy is doing what Luffy does, throwing himself headfirst through the battlefield with absolutely no regard for his own safety. With Ivankov and his growing crew of ex-convicts at his back, he pushes through the marine lines with a bruised and battered body, but an unbreakable will. Garp stands on the execution platform watching his grandson fight, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles go white. He has chosen duty his entire life, but watching Luffy bleed his way across the battlefield for his brother makes that choice feel like the heaviest thing he has ever carried. When Luffy finally reaches the platform, Garp stands in his way, and then, like in the original timeline, he steps aside. With Mr. Three's wax and sheer determination, Luffy breaks Ace's chains and the brothers are reunited. For just a moment, in the middle of all that chaos, everything feels okay. Ace is free. They just have to run. But then comes Sakazuki. The admiral appears with magma dripping from his fists, his eyes burning with cold fury. He begins taunting Ace, words cutting deep without Whitebeard, about his lineage, about everything Ace holds sacred. And Ace, despite knowing better, despite every instinct telling him to run, turns around. His flames flare as he charges at Sakazuki in a rage, but the difference in power is too great. Ace is quickly overwhelmed and beaten down, and as Luffy scrambles toward them, Sakazuki rears back and launches a devastating magma fist aimed squarely at Luffy's chest. Time slows down. Ace moves to step in front of it. This is the moment everyone remembers, the moment that broke the fandom in half, and then the entire world stops. A pressure descends on Marineford so immense that it is physically felt, not just by the fighters on the ground, but by everyone. The sea around the island churns, the air goes completely still, weaker Marines crumple to the ground without a single punch being thrown. Even Sakazuki's magma fist freezes in mid-air as the admiral instinctively halts, because something has stepped out of the shadows of Marineford's inner fortress, and every single person on that battlefield feels it in their bones. Emu has revealed himself. Nobody moves. Not the Whitebeard pirates, not the Marines, not the warlords. A figure unlike anything they have ever encountered moves slowly into view, flanked on all sides by the five elders. Sengoku goes pale. Garp's eyes widen. Even Doflamingo, the man who laughs at everything, goes completely silent. This is a presence that should not exist outside of the empty throne. Emu's eyes move slowly across the battlefield, and then they find what they're looking for. First Ace, then Luffy, the son of Goldie Roger, and the boy carrying Joy Boy's power, both standing right there in front of them. No words are spoken. Emu simply raises a hand toward the brothers. Whitebeard moves first. The old man who has declared every single member of his crew his child is not going to stand by while two of the most important young lives in the world are snuffed out. With a roar that shakes the island to its core, Whitebeard drives his Vicento into the ground and unleashes the full force of the Gura Gura no Mi directly at Emu. The earthquake tears through Marineford like the island is being ripped apart at the seams. It is the most devastating attack Whitebeard has ever thrown, but Emu just takes it, not unaffected, but standing. Whitebeard stares in disbelief as Emu's attention shifts toward him, and what follows is the most one-sided fight anyone has ever seen the strongest man alive in. He fights like a man half his age, throwing everything he has. But Emu's ancient power is on a completely different level. Each exchange pushes Whitebeard further further and further back, his body already ravaged by age and illness, and the wounds of this very war is beginning to give out. Garp watches all of this and does not move. The hero of the Marines, the man who has fought Goldie Roger to a standstill, who has punched mountains flat with his bare fists, stands completely still. Everything he has given his life to has been built on a lie. Every order he has followed, every criminal he has captured, every time he has chosen duty over family, all of it has been in service of this, a being that treats the world like a chessboard and its people like pieces. Seeing the one-sided defeat of Whitebeard, Luffy snaps. It is not a decision. It comes from somewhere far deeper than that. The grief, the rage, and the love all collide at once until something gives way. The drums of liberation begin to beat. White smoke curls from Luffy's body, and Gear 5 arrives, not in Wano, but here at Marineford, ahead of everything. Imu stops, and for the first time since arriving on the battlefield, something changes in their expression. This is what they feared. The power of Joy Boy, reawakened in a new generation, standing right in front of them. Imu abandons all focus on Ace and turns everything toward Luffy. The attack that follows is unlike anything Marineford has seen. Imu unleashes their destructive power, the same force that erased Lulusia Kingdom from the face of the earth, and directs it at the boy in front of them. The ground splits apart. Parts of Marineford simply cease to exist. Marines and pirates alike are sent flying in every direction as the battlefield is torn to pieces. But Gear 5 Luffy is moving, laughing even. His body bends and stretches in impossible ways as he weaves through the destruction. The very ground turns rubbery beneath his feet. He throws himself at Imu with everything he has, his punches wrapping the air around them, his movements completely unpredictable. The fight is spectacular. It is chaotic and absurd and somehow terrifying all at once. But Luffy is still early in this form. His body has not built the endurance for it yet, and as the seconds tick by, his movements slow. The grin stays on his face, but the steam rising from his body tells a different story. He is burning out fast. Imu raises their hand one final time as Luffy drops to one knee, his Gear 5 flickering. Whitebeard is down. The Whitebeard pirates are in disarray. The Marines have scattered. There is nobody left to step in. And then a sword cleaves through the air with enough force to split the sky itself. Shanks lands between Luffy and Imu. His boots hit the ground of Marineford, and the shockwave alone knocks dozens of people off their feet. Griffin is drawn, still crackling from the block it just made against Imu's attack. And Shanks stands with his back to Luffy, eyes locked directly onto the ruler of the world. The entire battlefield falls into a second silence, because if the first silence was shock, this one is something different. This is the silence of people watching two forces that should never occupy the same space, standing 10 feet apart. Shanks felt it from far out at sea, a hockey signature so ancient and overwhelming that it reached him before any news ever could. He pushed his crew to their absolute limit to get there in time, and he arrived with barely a second to spare. What comes next is something the world has never seen and will never forget. Shanks and Gear 5 Luffy side by side, the man who started Luffy on this journey, and the boy who turned that journey into a legend, fighting together against the single greatest threat the world contains. Shanks' swordsmanship is devastating and precise, each strike carrying the weight of a conqueror's haki so refined that the air itself shakes around his blade. Luffy's Gear 5 is the polar opposite. Wild, unpredictable, almost playful, his body stretching and snapping and warping reality around him in ways that make even Imu hesitate for a fraction of a second before each attack. Together they were something extraordinary. Shanks covered the openings that Gear 5's unpredictability created, and Luffy filled the gaps that even Shanks' precision couldn't reach. They hadn't trained together. They had no plan, but somehow they moved like they understood exactly what the other was going to do. But even together, Shanks and an exhausted Gear 5 Luffy could only hold the line for so long. Luffy's form was flickering badly now. The white fading in and out of his body screamed at him to stop. Shanks was holding his ground, but barely. Even as Conqueror's haki was meeting something it simply couldn't overpower. Imu had not moved from their position. They didn't need to. They were simply waiting for the two of them to run out of time. And then the sea behind Marineford erupted. A ship cut through the water at a speed that defied reason. And the figure standing at its bow carried a presence that was different from anything that had landed on this battlefield so far. Not ancient like Imu's, not overwhelming like Whitebeard's. This was something sharp and cold and furious. The haki of a man who had spent years hunting this exact moment. Monkey D. Dragon had arrived at Marineford. Nobody had seen it coming. Not Sengoku, not the admirals, not even Shanks. But Dragon had seen it coming for a long time. The Revolutionary Army had been quietly tracking the movements of Imu for years, watching for the slightest deviation from routine, the smallest crack in the world government's ironclad secrecy. When the reports came in that something unprecedented was being set into motion around Marineford, Dragon had already been moving. He hadn't come for the war or for Ace. He had come because he had always known that if Imu ever stepped off the empty throne, it would be the moment everything changed. Dragon stepped onto the ruins of Marineford and the battlefield held its breath. His cloak whipped in the storm charged wind around him as his eyes found Imu across the wreckage. For the first time since the battle began, the five elders looked uncertain, because Dragon's arrival hadn't just changed the numbers, it had changed the meaning of what was happening here. The leader of the Revolutionary Army, the man who had declared war on the world government itself, standing face to face with the being at the top of it, it, Dragon took his place beside Shanks, who glanced sideways at him without a word. There was only one reason either of them was standing here, and then, from behind them both, the ground shook. It wasn't an earthquake, it wasn't emo. It was a single pair of boots hitting the broken stone of Marineford as Edward Newgate, battered, bleeding, pushed further than he had ever been pushed in his life, forced himself back onto his feet. Marco rushed out to stop him. Whitebeard silenced him with a look. The old man rolled his neck, gripped his bacento with both hands, and walked forward until he stood alongside Dragon, alongside Shanks, alongside the boy in the white coat whose Gear 5 was clinging on by sheer willpower alone. 4 of them, standing together, facing Emu, Whitebeard, Shanks, Dragon, Luffy, the strongest man alive, the Emperor of the Sea, the most wanted man in the world, and the boy who just refused to stop smiling. Emu looked at them, and for the first time, for the very first time, nobody on that battlefield could tell what the ruler of the world was going to do next. And then the 5 elders stepped forward. They moved as one. 5 figures who had stood behind thrones and pulled the strings of the world for centuries now walked onto a battlefield for the first time in living memory. The 5 of them spread across the ruins of Marineford like a wall, and then without a word between them, they split off. Saturn moved toward Whitebeard because he was the most wounded and therefore, in the elders' cold calculation, the most manageable. Nesjiro and Mars turned toward Shanks, 2 against 1, which even by their standards said something about how much they respected the Emperor's sword. Warcury locked his sights on Luffy, the boy whose power had rattled even Emu's composure and who needed to be put down before he found a second wind. And Jupiter turned to face Dragon. Shanks met Nesjiro and Mars simultaneously, and the clash was immediate and brutal. 2 of the most powerful figures in the world government against a one-armed swordsman, and Shanks was giving ground, but barely, and not without cost. Every time one of them pressed an opening, Griffin was already moving to close it. Shanks fought with the kind of calm that only comes from a man who has long since made peace with the idea of dying and simply decided not to. His conqueror's haki pressed outward in waves that cracked the stone beneath their feet and kept the elders from finding a clean angle. On the other side of the ruins, Warcury ran down on Luffy with a force that would have ended most fights instantly. Luffy's body bent around attacks that should have landed. He laughed through impacts that should have knocked him out. The problem was that each exchange cost him more than it cost Warcury, and everyone watching could see the white draining a little further from Luffy's hair with every passing second. He was fighting on fumes and stubbornness and nothing else. Saturn reached Whitebeard and found a man who was already running on something beyond physical endurance. Whitebeard met him with the Gura Gura no Mi, and the fight that followed was devastating in both directions, but mostly in one. Saturn's power was immense, and Whitebeard's body had simply run out of the ability to absorb punishment. Each hit landed like it was driving a nail deeper. Blood darkened the front of Whitebeard's shirt. Marco, watching from a distance, gripped the railing of a nearby structure so hard it bent. And then there was Dragon. Jupiter approached him with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never lost. Dragon stood still and watched him come. The wind around Marineford had been building since Dragon arrived. Subtle at first, then less so. The clouds overhead had darkened and begun to rotate. Nobody had noticed it in the chaos of the other fights, but Dragon had noticed. He had been letting it build deliberately. When Jupiter attacked, Dragon moved, and the storm moved with him. What happened next was something nobody on that battlefield had ever seen. Dragon's devil fruit, the one the world government had spent years trying to identify and classify, revealed itself in full force for the first time. The winds didn't just bend, they obeyed. Columns of pressurized air hit Jupiter with the force of cannonballs, each one precisely aimed, arriving before the Elder could read where the next was coming from. He fought like a natural disaster that had learned patience. Jupiter had driven back once, then twice, then a third time, and by the 4th exchange he was on the ground and not getting up quickly. Dragon turned and found Warcury still pressing Luffy hard. He crossed the battlefield in seconds, the wind carrying him faster than his stride should have allowed, and hit Warcury with an attack that sent the Elder skidding across the broken stone of Marineford with enough force to carve a groove in it. Warcury rose slowly. Dragon was already standing over him. The storm overhead answered every movement Dragon made now. Lightning flickered at the edges of the clouds, the pressure in the air dropping sharply. Warcury looked up at the man above him, and for just a moment something crossed his face. He had underestimated this. Dragon brought the storm down, and Warcury did not get up again. 2 elders down. Emu watched from a distance, and for the first time there was the faintest trace of interest in their expression. Shanks had been grinding down Nesjiro and Mars for several brutal minutes, and the tide had shifted slowly in his favor. The 2 elders had expected to overwhelm him quickly, and the fact that they hadn't had thrown off their rhythm. Shanks exploited every crack that opened between them. A perfectly timed hockey clash here, a feint that drew one out of position while the blade found the other. Shanks took hits that would have put most people in the ground, but when Nesjiro finally overreached on a lunge, Shanks' counter was so precise and so devastating that it ended the fight in a single exchange. Mars, suddenly alone, lasted another 30 seconds before Shanks' conqueror hockey hit him like a physical wave and took him off his feet for good. 4 down, Saturn and Whitebeard were still going, but barely. Whitebeard had taken punishment that was genuinely frightening to witness. He was bleeding from more places than anyone wanted to count. His breathing was labored, and his movements had slowed to a fraction of what they had been. But the old man's eyes were still burning. Saturn pressed forward for what he clearly believed would be the finishing crushing blow, and Whitebeard caught it. Just barely. Just enough. He drove his Basento into the ground, used it as a lever, and threw Saturn across the battlefield with the last large burst of Gura Gura no Mi power he had left in him. Saturn hit the far wall of Marineford's ruins and did not move, and now all 5 elders were down. The 4 of them, after their victory, moved toward Imu together. There was no signal and no plan. It just happened. All 4 closing in from different angles at the same moment, like they had rehearsed it. Shanks came from the left with Griffin drawn back for a horizontal slash, carrying his full Conqueror's output. Dragon came straight ahead, the storm overhead responding instantly. A concentrated column of wind pressure aimed directly at Imu's body. Whitebeard drove his Basento down in a shockwave that split the ground between them, and Luffy, his Gear 5, making one last push on pure willpower, stretched his arm back and launched himself forward like a cannonball at full stretch. Imu dodged, not with urgency. Shanks's blade found empty air. Dragon's storm hit nothing. Whitebeard's shockwave tore up the ground where Imu had been standing a fraction of a second earlier. Luffy's fist sailed through, and Luffy went sprawling past. They regrouped and went again, and again, Luffy tried coming from above, stretching to the edge of his range before crashing down. Shanks and Dragon attacked in the same instant from opposite sides, trying to close off every angle. Whitebeard stopped trying to aim precisely and simply unleashed, cracking the air in every direction, turning the ground into a wave. None of it landed. There was no frustration in Imu's expression, no urgency. They were entertaining this, and that was the most unsettling thing of all. After what felt like a long time but was probably less than a minute, Imu stopped moving. They stood in the center of the 4 of them, completely still, and looked at each other in turn. Luffy was panting, pushing Gear 5 to its limit. Shanks had a fresh cut across his forearm from one of the redirected exchanges. Dragon's storm was still present overhead but visibly weakened as the focus it required became harder to maintain. Whitebeard was barely upright. Imu raised their hand. It wasn't targeted at any one person. It was simply enormous. A release of power that expanded outward from Imu's palm like a wall. The air itself compressed and then detonating in a wave that had no gap in it. There was no dodging it. It hit all 4 of them at the same time. When the dust and smoke settled, 3 of them were still conscious. Shanks was on his back against a collapsed section of the wall, Griffin still in his hand, but his arm too heavy to lift it. Dragon was face down on the ground, the storm overhead dissolving into ordinary rain as his concentration broke. Whitebeard was on one knee, his Basento driven into the ground as the only thing keeping him upright, blood running freely down the side of his face. All 3 of them were looking at the same thing. Luffy was on the ground in the middle of the blast zone, completely still. The white had gone from his hair, and the wide grin from his face. Gear 5 had finally given out, leaving behind a boy who had pushed his body so far past its limit that he had nothing left, not even consciousness. Eyes closed, looking impossibly small against the wreckage of Marineford around him. Imu walked toward him slowly. Nobody moved to stop it, not because they didn't want to, but couldn't, and everywhere else on Marineford, those still standing stood completely still out of fear. Imu crouched beside Luffy, looked at him for a moment, then carried him and disappeared into darkness. Subscribe and smash the like button for more One Piece videos.